Hi folks, my name's Sean. I'm here today to take you on a bit of a tour in fulfillment for Environmental 514's Assignment 2. I'm going to go on a bit of a field tour of my workplace, in fact, and discuss some of the local impacts of global climate change. All the photos that you will see today were taken by me, most of them within the last few days, otherwise within the last few months, and some are actually from last spring and summer where necessary to demonstrate some of the points I'm trying to make. So, where is that? Well, we're here, just outside the west border of Nahanni National Park Reserve, a tiny mining town of Tungsten in the Northwest Territories. It's just a few kilometers east of the Yukon border. Nahanni is one of Canada's greatest natural treasures and the first ever UNESCO World Heritage Site. I took these aerial photos during a flight last summer from meeting in Fort Simpson and Nahanni Butte over the park to site. I referred to Tungsten as a town because it was once a small village when workers were first on site in the 1960s. Their whole families were living here with them. However, for decades now, it's been operating in a fly-in, fly-out basis, much like any other camp operation, so I can't really claim to call it a town, but it does have a name. It's not very creatively named, but it's known as Tungsten Northwest Territories. According to the synthesis of Lemon, Warren, and Lacroix's From Impacts to Adaptations, Canada in a Changing Climate, Northern Canada currently has already experienced sufficient climate-related changes that, coupled with its limitations and adaptive capacity, make some northern systems and populations particularly vulnerable to climate change. Infrastructure maintenance and design are very significant challenges for the North at the best of times, and traditional lifestyles will be more difficult to maintain while new opportunities and challenges may arise in the North due to increased navigability of marine waters. So besides environmental impacts of climate change, one of the things that we've been exploring in this course and highlighting the importance of is the socioeconomic impacts of climate change and global climate change events and impacts. I'm going to start with some of these, as the unique situation of this operation is kind of what introduces some of the other unique environmental challenges that I will introduce afterwards. So on this journey around the mine site, one thing is going to be glaringly obvious. There's practically nobody here. Due to sustained low prices of most heavy metals globally, the mine has entered a care and maintenance phase, and there's actually only 6 people currently on site as the government prepares for future reclamation activities. It could be argued that the impact the fossil fuel economy has had on the environment is beginning to result in the slowing of the economy itself. What I mean by that is that if there were no impact from burning fossil fuels, there wouldn't be necessarily any reason for a requirement for us to move towards alternative energy sources and to act on climate change. And so the current slowing of the oil and gas industry that we're witnessing might be part of a larger trend, and the mining industry is, of course, associated with this in various ways. In some ways, can be a benefit, and in some ways, low oil prices are highly detrimental to the mining industry in Canada. And so it's important to understand the effect that this slowing economy, which has impacted this mine in particular, has on the region and the local area. This particular site is 310 kilometers by a mountain gravel road to the nearest town, and that town's only 1,500 people as it is. Dozens of our employees were from that town, and following their layoff, most of them likely remain out of work so far. This kind of thing can have a really big impact in most communities. There's a lot of health and social challenges that can be associated with financial hardship, and these kinds of impacts are particularly magnified in such small communities, in my opinion. whether the mine were shut down or not, changing climate and weather patterns can have a really big effect on operations in such a difficult place of the world to complete work as it is. So we've talked a lot about how climate change can introduce more sporadic weather patterns and less predictability. This can have really big impacts for operations as transporting supplies to site can become very difficult. And you have things like road washouts, avalanches, things like that. Impacts on food costs actually is another thing. With our changing economy, we also see changes in currency values and many trickle-down effects from that. It can be argued that all of these are some form of response to global climate change. And when food costs go up, the financial feasibility of certain operations can be actually highly impacted. So yeah, as you can imagine, for such a remote area, there's a lot of wildlife around, some big, some small, and these changing weather patterns can have impacts on them as well. Food can become scarce at certain times of the year, um, and any impact on fall food sources for large critters like bears can have very big impacts on the populations. In addition to that, changing temperature regimes and in particular increased flux in temperatures really can have impacts on the aquatic systems as the ice cover on the rivers and lakes in the area um, tend to be less consistent and less steady throughout the winter than they were and typically would be. In addition to variation in weather patterns, we see an overall warming trend, of course. This has impacts on glaciers in the area and the timing of snow runoff events and sometimes the duration of them. So this can have a lot of environmental impacts. We deal with runoff on site during the spring, and if that is either increased in magnitude or the duration of that season where turbid waters can be introduced to the aquatic systems is lengthened, it can have impacts as well. For example, it could interfere with spawning activities at certain times of year of various aquatic species. Something else that we've read about so far in this course is in the north, you have areas where permafrost is melting. That acts potentially as a source of carbon to the atmosphere, which is a positive feedback loop in the increasing atmospheric CO2 problem that we already see. And now there's no permafrost in the location that I'm at. We have read about how the boreal forest may increase primary productivity and or expand its range with warming temperatures as permafrost disappears, and that can actually act as an offset of this new carbon source to the atmosphere, although probably not to the extent that would be required to completely neutralize it. But in any case, it's reasonable to conclude that any change in forest type at this particular site would be on a much longer scale, time scale in particular, and might not necessarily be seen right here in tungsten, but any small shifts in species distribution could have very real ecological and environmental impacts on site and in the area. Also, reductions in the length of the snow cover season is a global climate issue that is sort of a self-perpetuating or positive feedback loop in the warming of the Earth's climate. As the amount of snow is reduced and that season is shortened, less reflectance of ultraviolet rays occurs, and you see more absorption of that radiation by the Earth, which only exacerbates the ongoing problem, of course. Now, if you agree that the fact that the mine is not in operation is in some way related to the effects of global climate change, then you could also argue that global climate change is increasing the liability of this existing operation's impact on the environment. With less people here, it's conceivable that any sort of risks from the tails dams or fuel storage areas, things like that, are potentially less likely to be detected and with less capacity to mitigate them quickly than might be the case under a full operational situation. One particular example I can think of is the old town site. There's a bunch of old standing houses that you see here. These aren't used anymore, but they've been there since the original town was built in the 60s. We were planning to reclaim these buildings last summer before financial difficulties came upon us, and some of the siding is asbestos filled, and a lot of the paint used was lead paint. And so we had an extensive reclamation plan in place that was going to be a corporate cost. And now it's conceivable that if the reclamation of the site as a whole costs more than the securities bonds that the government holds of ours, then the remaining cost would essentially be a government or taxpayer cost. And so in this way, global climate change is costing the citizens of Canada more money, not only by the loss of jobs, but by additional costs to protect the environment from that shutdown in operations. So that about wraps up everything I've got to show you today. I hope you've enjoyed your little photo field trip of my workplace, and thanks for staying tuned. Take care.